Welcome to NSS Connections. My name is Gwen Peer, and I'm here in the NSS offices in New York City. The title of today's presentation is Talented Daughter of a Famous Father, the Life and Sculpture of Margaret French Cresson. And our special guest speaker is Dana Pilson. If that name sounds familiar, it may be because you've already read the summer issue of Sculpture Review that you received in the mail. Dana wrote the article on Margaret French Cresson. This is the summer issue. Dana has been working on curatorial projects for Chesterwood for approximately 10 years, where her first project was researching and documenting the history of Daniel Chester French's Chesterwood studio. Since then, she has assisted with numerous exhibitions and publications and has co-curated exhibitions and installations focusing on the sculpture of Daniel Chester French, as well as that of his daughter, Margaret. In 2018, Dana and Chesterwood's director, Donna Hassler, traveled to Italy to follow in D.C. French's footsteps through Florence and Rome. In addition to the current article in Sculpture Review about Margaret French Cresson, Dana recently published an article examining the relationship between Chester French, and his protege, sculptor Evelyn Beatrice Longman. Before moving to the Berkshires, Dana was a research assistant in the Metropolitan Museum's American Wing, where she worked on various curatorial projects, including focusing on Thomas Eakins, Childe Hassam, and Maurice Prendergast. She graduated from Dartmouth College with a degree in English and went on to study art history with a focus in American painting, sculpture, and architecture at Boston University and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Although she lives in the Berkshires, she claims that her heart is in New York, and she returns as often as possible to visit museums and art galleries and to wander the streets looking at architecture and enjoying the fabric of this city. So before I pass the mic to Dana, I do want to mention that we've had nearly 100 people RSVP for this event, so please remain muted so as not to distract from our speaker. I encourage you to enter any questions in the chat room. We will try to get to all of them, and we may even go to gallery view and have you ask directly depending on whether that becomes chaotic or not. So Dana, I am now going to spotlight you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen.
There you go.
Okay. Are we all set? Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. Hello and good evening. My name is Dana Pilson, and as Gwen said in the introduction, I'm a curatorial researcher at Chesterwood, the National Trust Historic Site, and the historic home, studio, and gardens of Daniel Chester French in Stockbridge. I'm excited to tell you that Chesterwood is open for the season, Thursdays through Mondays. Tickets are available online, and specialty tours are offered on weekends. These tours are free for members. What a great incentive to become a member. So please check the website, chesterwood.org, for more information about visiting and membership. It is with gratitude and humility that I acknowledge that Chesterwood is located on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of the Eastern Seaboard. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here in the 1800s, today, their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. If you would like to learn more about the people of the waters that are never still, please go to their website at www.mohican.com, and I can share that later if you are interested. I'm so pleased to introduce you to the life and work of Margaret French Cresson, daughter of sculptor Daniel Chester French. If you happen to have seen my recent article in Sculpture Review, you may have read that she was an accomplished artist, writer, and early preservationist. She was active with many artistic groups, such as the Architectural League of New York, the National Academy of Design, and the National Sculpture Society, exhibiting works, contributing articles to the Society's journal, and serving as secretary from 1940 to 42. She created a museum at Chesterwood and perpetuated her father's legacy through writing numerous articles, as well as a biography titled Journey into Fame. Visitors learn about her role in preserving the site, but her accomplishments as an artist are less well known. If after this talk you were eager to learn even more about her life and work, I invite you to take a look at the online exhibition available through Chesterwood's website. It features about 24 works by Margaret, photographs of her growing up at Chesterwood, and portraits of her by other artists. Later this summer, we'll be adding more of her sculpture to the Chesterwood studio, so I invite you to visit and see some of her works in person. I'm grateful to Robin Salmon and Gordon Alt at Sculpture Review for printing my article in the summer 2021 issue, and of course to Gwen Peer for inviting me to present this talk. Here we go. Margaret French Cresson, Peggy to her friends and family, and I'll refer to her as Margaret in this talk, was the only child of sculptor Daniel Chester French, the foremost sculptor of the late 19th, early 20th century. He created over 100 public monuments and memorials, and many more works are in museums and private collections. He is best known for his Minuteman in Concord, Massachusetts, that you see at the left, and the seated iconic Abraham Lincoln in the nation's capital. Both of these works depict American icons: the young farmer who sets aside his plow and takes up his musket to fight in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and Lincoln, who embodied, as French put it, great good common sense. It was he who saw straight when all the rest were seeing crooked. The seated Lincoln is considered the country's greatest public sculpture and is a monument of extraordinary beauty and compelling solemnity. Oh, I think I hear someone.
I'll find them. Sorry.
It's okay, I just hear a little bit of a chatter. Okay. Other notable works by French include the Millmore Memorial in Boston, dedicated to the talented stone carver Joseph Millmore and his brother, sculptor Martin Millmore, which you see on the left. The figure representing death, with her enormous draping wings, stays the hand of the young sculptor as he chisels away on a bas-relief of a sphinx, which refers to Millmore's American Sphinx in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. French's Melvin Memorial, which you see at the right, commemorates 3 brothers who all died in the Civil War. Morning Victory is carved in deep relief as she emerges from beneath a heavy, burdensome American flag. These allegorical works are serene, poetic, and timeless. French has transformed the intangible, victory, death, and grief into figures with faces, bodies, and emotions. Other notable works by French include the buoyant, joyful Spirit of Life in Saratoga Springs, New York, and the Milton War Memorial in Eastern Massachusetts. The Spirit of Life celebrates Spencer Trask, a Saratoga businessman killed in a tragic train accident. French's first version had included a winged figure with downcast head and drooping wings. The patron, Trask's widow, Katrina Trask, worked closely with French to come up with a more uplifting and positive image. In the end, French felt this was one of his finest works. Malvina Hoffman, a successful sculptor who had studied with Rodin, helped French come up with the design for the Milton Memorial, also titled In Flanders Fields, which you see at the right. And we recently learned that the versatile Black model, Maurice Hunter, posed for this work. In all of the works we have seen, we see French's talent in transforming lofty ideals and intangible concepts, heroism and patriotism, goodness and beneficence, joy and pain, into accessible imagery. He excelled in creating allegorical figures, both male and female, that personified ideals, and he rendered the poetic real. French could make us believe that angels truly walked among us. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. French and his wife, Mary, were dividing their time between New York City and Concord, Massachusetts, when their daughter, Margaret, was born in August 1889. Shortly after her arrival, French wrote, "The infant is perfectly matured and of good weight, reckoned at 8 pounds. I was surprised to see so human looking a little thing." She grew into a charming child, and around her 3rd birthday, her father reported, "Margaret is rosy and well as can be and is universally popular." She is pictured at the left with her mother in French's New York studio, with the model for the Millmore Memorial behind them. You may recognize the figure of death that we had just seen. In 1896, when Margaret was almost 7 years old, French and his wife visited the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts, looking to buy a country home to offer respite from city life. They fell in love with the farm in the Glendale section of Stockbridge, which they purchased right away. French enlisted his friend and colleague, the architect Henry Bacon, to design first a studio and later a new residence to replace the aging farmhouse on the site. French named the estate Chesterwood, and for the next 3 decades, the French family would spend the warmer months here. He was once asked, "Do you live in the country all the year round?" He whimsically replied, "No, I live here 6 months of the year in heaven. The other 6 months I live, well, in New York." Thought the New Yorkers among you might appreciate that. At Chesterwood, French took his young daughter on long walks in the woods and along the garden paths, and she reveled in the flowers and all the wonders of nature. Summers were idyllic, and the family hosted neighborhood parties. Several hundred children and parents would come to eat ice cream and to watch a show in the old barn. The house constantly buzzed with visiting extended family members and good friends. Here's Margaret at the far left with a group of children, including her cousin Louise French at the top in a smart jacket and tam. Both Margaret and Louise would model for artists visiting Chesterwood, including the sculptor Evelyn Beatrice Longman. French put his daughter to work as a model. She is pictured at the left in one of the earliest photos we have of the studio reception room, and at right in the studio garden, wearing an old-fashioned dress and bonnet. Here are 2 more photos of Margaret posing for photographs in the garden. As a young girl at the left, by the Excedra, the long curved bench that French designed, and as a teenager at the right. The photo is very much in the then current aesthetic of posing beautiful young women among blooming flowers. American Impressionists such as Childe Hassam, Richard Miller, and Lila Cabot Perry often included women and children amongst colorful blooms in their paintings. Excuse me. Here are some of the earliest works for which Margaret modeled. At left, the Newcomer Fountain for Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Baltimore, and on the right, one of a pair of reliefs for the Clark Memorial in Forest Hill Cemetery outside of Boston. French has captured the girl's charming and sweet profile and her chubby hands clasped in prayer. Father and daughter must have had a very special relationship for her to sit still for him for so long, at such a young age. She was only 5 when she modeled for the Clark Memorial. I recently traveled to Baltimore and had the chance to see French's Newcomer Fountain. Bathed in diffuse light through stained glass windows, the work is luminous. I especially love the attention French paid to the angel's feet, the nape of her neck, and the lovely folds of the drapery. The young Margaret also modeled for the Chapman Memorial, a work commemorating a pioneer dry goods merchant from Milwaukee. Here we see her dressed in classical robes, carefully holding a delicate object in her hands. At right is the final work, which is in Milwaukee. French later kept the working model of the figure for the Chapman Memorial in the reception room of his New York studio next to the fireplace. The recently conserved working model can now be seen in the Chesterwood studio, which you see at right. Margaret posed for Evangeline, the young Acadian woman who searches for her long-lost love during the time of the expulsion of the Acadians, one of 6 relief figures in her father's memorial to poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Cambridge. Seen here in the Chesterwood studio, Margaret poses in period dress, while French, at the far left, seems to be examining the work through a mirror. A lay figure, a full-size posable model, is perched on a pedestal at the left. You can see it wrapped in drapery. And when you come and see the studio today, you'll see that it looks very much the same as it does in these historical photographs. French not only captured his daughter's likeness in sculpture, but he enjoyed making portraits in oil and pastel. Here are 2 pastels, the one at the left from when the French family was visiting fellow sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens's art colony in Cornish, New Hampshire in 1893. At the right is a radiant portrayal of Margaret. The details and delicate touches remind us of the great love that French had for his only child. Notice the attention he pays to her clasped hands, as if making up for the unfinished nature of the earlier pastel. Both of these works are in the Chesterwood Works on Paper collection that was recently transferred to Chapin Library at Williams College. French enjoyed making portraits and would do it in his free time, often in the reception room of the studio, under the windows that let in the gentle north light. Around this time, he wrote to former studio assistant and fellow sculptor Evelyn Beatrice Longman, "I really think I am gaining in the art of painting." Here's Margaret in light summer linen with a big broad-brimmed hat, posing against the new white and green wallpaper that French's wife had chosen for the residence's parlor. The one on the left is oil on canvas, and the one on the right is a related pastel. In a letter to his brother, French mentions that Margaret prefers New York to Stockbridge, and he is consoling her by painting her portrait. Later he writes, "My portrait of Margaret is coming on so well that I expect to out Sergeant soon. I have not had so much fun since the early days of sculpture." And upon completing the work, he announced, "My picture of Margaret seems to be a great popular success, and I have been advised to set up as a fashionable painter." While we are grateful for these magnificent portraits of Margaret, we can also be thankful that he did not give up his career in sculpture. In June of 1913, French wrote to his brother, "Robert Vanno is coming here this next week to paint Margaret and me. I can see why he would like to paint Margaret." Over the course of 3 weeks, the well-known Impressionist painter created this attractive portrait of Margaret, seated at the window in her father's study, bathed in sunlight and wearing a summery pink dress. She holds a brilliant green glass vase filled with the bright peonies that naturally bloom in the studio garden in mid to late June. This painting is related to a photograph of Margaret, most likely a preparatory image, perhaps taken by Vanno during his visit. In the photograph, Margaret is seated in a white Windsor armchair, and the green glass vase holds wispy, tall grass. Many of the objects depicted in the photograph and the painting are still at Chesterwood. The chair is in the study, and the glass vase and the pedestal table are in the residence parlor. Thomas Shields Clark was a painter, sculptor, and photographer who lived nearby at Fernbrook in Lenox. He used the autochrome process, patented in 1903 by the Lumiere brothers in France. It is wonderful to see Margaret in the Chesterwood garden. She's at the far left with her hand on the fountain, captured in soft pastels, much like an Impressionist painting. A researcher at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts recently uncovered about 100 of Clark's autochromes 5 years ago. She called the autochrome process one of the most beautiful photography processes ever invented. I think you might agree, these are quite beautiful. Margaret grew up in a house filled with antique furniture, paintings, and sculpture. She was used to meeting and interacting with artists, studio assistants, architects, and patrons, as well as other notable people who were friends of the family, such as writers Henry James and Edith Wharton, who often consulted with French about garden design. Margaret traveled with her father to dedications, world's fairs, and other expositions, and accompanied him in place of her mother to dinners and other social events. She traveled out west to Mexico, Panama, and in 1910 took a grand tour of Europe, from where French reported that he was pleased that Margaret has shown such an interest in the pictures and the statues and the things of historical interest. She covered every inch of the walls of her room with framed reproductions of paintings and photographs of friends and family, and she filled the shelves with bric-a-brac and works of art, such as a reduction of her father's figure of John Harvard. Like her father, she was a consummate collector and was interested in books, paintings, and tastefully decorated interiors. Margaret had her social debut in New York in 1910, and that winter, French wrote that she was enjoying life with festivities and late hours and all the things that a young girl in New York society can have. At right is Margaret with a large group of friends at a dinner party, possibly in her father's New York studio, where she often hosted social events. And at left, Margaret and her friends are on the porch of the Chesterwood residence, having just tasted some punch they prepared for a garden party. In Stockbridge, Margaret was at the center of the summer social scene, and throngs of her friends arrived from the city to spend weekends at Chesterwood. During the daytime, they played tennis and croquet, picnicked, socialized on the residence porch, and frolicked on the property. In the evenings, she hosted nights filled with revelry, lively dinners, games of charades, concerts, and costume parties in the studio. Margaret's costume parties were an annual event. One year, she dressed up as the goddess Diana, and French couldn't resist snapping photos of her by the fountain in the studio garden. And at the right, as she played around with her friend Margaret Lamond, dressed as a woodland nymph by the columns at the start of the woodland walk. Her vivacious spirit is captured by sculptor Evelyn Beatrice Longman, a trailblazing female artist who, after studying and working with French, went on to have a successful career creating portraits, allegorical works, and large-scale public monuments. Longman likens Margaret to a bacchante, a female reveler and follower of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and ecstasy, and counterpart to the Greek god Dionysus. This work was very popular, and Longman had additional bronzes cast. There are versions at Chesterwood, as well as in various museum collections, such as the Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey and the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Following on the heels of such a charmed adolescence was the advent of World War I, which the US entered in 1917. The war took the lives of many in Margaret's generation, including friends and family. Her first serious boyfriend was a young man named Philip Mills, who had attended St. Paul's School and Harvard. According to the Chesterwood guest books, he visited in June of 1912 and in September of 1917. I recently found this photo of him enjoying a game of tennis at the left. He was tragically killed in France in 1918. Margaret was very affected by this loss, and on the first anniversary of his death, she wrote a poignant letter to him. I picked some red poppies for you this morning and arranged them in vases in my room in front of your pictures. They are a real flame color, the kind that are growing near you in France, I am sure. French's World War I memorial for Philip's alma mater, St. Paul's School in Concord, must have had personal significance for Margaret, as a benevolent winged figure supports a young soldier at his moment of death. French was staunchly anti-war and called it a useless, humiliating, horrid spectacle. And he often quoted Shakespeare in this context, "What fools these mortals be." The French family was close with Stockbridge philanthropist Nina Durier, who chaired a French war relief organization. Margaret worked with her, attending wounded soldiers at a Red Cross hospital in New York City, which was, as she put it, full of tragedies and comedies, which we cannot forget. And you can see Margaret just to the left of the large typewriter. She became sick and exhausted from this experience, and it's possible she had even contracted the Spanish flu. She returned to Stockbridge to convalesce at the Austin Riggs Institute. And about this time, she met Pen Cresson, an author, historian, and diplomat who was 16 years older. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and practiced architecture in Washington, D.C. And he was later stationed to diplomatic posts in South America, Europe, and Russia. During World War I, he had served as chief of the American military mission in Belgium and spent time in a Russian prison camp. After the war, he focused on writing and teaching, holding professorships in law and diplomacy at Princeton, Columbia, and Tufts. Here, Margaret reclines against a planter on the front steps of the residence at Chesterwood, basking in the morning light, probably after a late night of festivities. And you can see Penn, who lounges at the far right, and another friend in the doorway. Their courtship is played out in a series of letters. Penn was living in Princeton and also traveled a great deal during this time. So the two corresponded almost daily. Their letters are filled with poetry, quotes from literature, little drawings, and more vivid imaginings of their future life together. They married in Taormina, Sicily in January 1921 in the English chapel in the monastery of Santa Caterina. Margaret and her family were spending the winter in Italy, and she had brought along her mother's wedding dress, although the date and place of the wedding had not been set by the time of their departure from New York. After their honeymoon, Margaret and Penn settled in Washington, D.C. You can see in these photographs of their home that they filled it with interesting antiques, objects, and works of art, such as a copy of a Renaissance portrait bust, a commercial plaster relief of a Madonna and Child, and a bronze Diana by Augustus St. Gaudens that Penn had purchased at an estate sale in Lenox, Massachusetts. They spent their summers at Chesterwood, living in the Dormouse, a quaint cottage that was a wedding gift from Margaret's father. Margaret had spent the summer of 1920 renovating the house and scouring Berkshire County auctions and estate sales for furniture and household items. She had written to Penn, "I don't care how tiny and simple the house may be, if it has personality and charm." Artist John C. Johansson, who summered in the Berkshires, painted a double portrait of Margaret and Penn relaxing in their living room at the Dormouse. Margaret knits while her husband relaxes in a window seat, reading one of the many books in their voluminous collection. And that is the painting at left. And at right is a painting that Johansson painted of French and his wife in a similar scene of domestic harmony and tranquility, seated in the parlor of the Chesterwood residence. Many of the objects included in the painting are still present in the parlor today. And I love looking at these two paintings together of Margaret and her husband and her two parents. Soon after finishing high school at New York's Brearley School, Margaret attended the New York School of Design for Women, founded in 1892 by the painter and philanthropist Ellen Dunlap Hopkins, who described her initial 45 students as women who were determined to study in order to compete with men in the arts, and whose endeavor it was to make places for themselves, not by asking sympathy and not by taking less pay than men, but by the excellence of their work. By the time Margaret was a student in 1913, the school had grown to 560 students and was the only one of its kind in the country. Courses were offered in illustration, design of book covers, interiors, wallpaper, and textiles, as well as architecture, and a wide range of other art and design courses. French reported to a friend, "Margaret has been distinguishing herself somewhat at the School of Applied Design by her drawing, which to an unprejudiced father seems quite remarkable." Much of the work she did there survives, including watercolors of flowers and many color and geometry studies. One of her studies is at right. You can see her name stamped. And at left is a photograph of an exhibition of these sorts of studies at the school. On a dare from a friend, and not at the urging of her father, Margaret tried her hand at sculpture and decided that she liked it and had some talent. She acquiesced to lessons from her father, who imposed a regime of what she described as interminable drawing from plaster casts and from models. And he had her copy in clay a commercial plaster cast of a bust of a little boy by Renaissance sculptor Desiderio da Settignano. You can see her first effort on the right side of the photo of Margaret in the studio. It's in clay, and then it's hard to see and it's very faint, but you can see the plaster cast. And I show you the marble version that's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. French wrote in 1915, "Margaret has taken up modeling at the advanced age of 26 and has been surprising her father as well as other people by her success in portraiture." These words would prove to be prescient as Margaret would find her greatest success in portraiture. This photo was taken from about the same time as the previous one, and you can see Margaret working side by side with her father. She is sculpting a bust of Julia Swift Gilbert, the daughter of architect Cass Gilbert, and a model for French's Manhattan. French is behind Margaret. You can see him at work on Brooklyn, the companion to Manhattan. The pair commissioned for the Brooklyn entrance to the Manhattan Bridge, and now flanking the main entrance to the Brooklyn Museum. Margaret knew that if she chose to take up the pursuit of sculpture seriously, she would be compared with her father. She later told a reporter, "I must stand or fall on what I do myself." Study continued with Abyssinia Eberly, best known for figurative works that combined Ashcan school realism with emphasis on the flow of drapery and movement. Later, Margaret studied with George Demetrios, who created animated and perceptive portraits. A reviewer wrote of his work, "The ruggedness of a quarry worker and the tenderness of a young child are rendered with equal perceptiveness." Although this photograph of Margaret standing behind a small sketch model is not dated, it is probably from her time as a student, as is this drawing of a model, which we discovered as we went through the drawings collection at Chesterwood. Also in the drawings collection is a sketch pad with many drawings by Margaret after works by her father, including this one after the working model of the Chapman Memorial, which you may remember that we saw earlier. Throughout her career, she would look to her father's work for inspiration, and here she drew what could be seen as a self-portrait of herself at a much younger age. Already we see her skill in animating a figure. She has added a depth of feeling, I think, that differs from the sculpted work. One of the first works that Margaret exhibited was Girl with the Curls, which she submitted to the annual Stockbridge exhibition in 1920. A reviewer wrote, "The natural astonishment felt by its admirers on learning that it was the first exhibited work by a new sculptress will be lessened when they learn that the artist is the daughter of Daniel Chester French, and so comes naturally by her poetic inspiration and distinction of workmanship." It also caught the notice of other artists. Sculptor Malvina Hoffman had exclaimed, "That is sculpture." Margaret created the original work in clay, which was then cast in plaster. She had it carved into marble by the Piccirilli brothers, a family of Italian marble carvers, as well as cast in bronze at Gorham's foundry, in the hopes of exhibiting them at various exhibitions and eventually selling them. French kept a version of Girl with the Curls in his studio, and he enjoyed seeing his friends marvel over it. He wrote to Margaret in December of 1922, "Everybody who comes to my studio admires it, and it seems as if it ought to sell." On the right is a historical photograph of the cozy corner, a nook off of the studio's reception room, showing the Girl with the Curls and the antique dresser. And I hope you can see it at left. And actually, just to the right of it is the first version of French's Spirit of Life. This one is called Spirit of the Waters that I had mentioned earlier. Margaret also showed her Italian youth at the 1920 Stockbridge exhibition. A portrait of a swashbuckling, kerchiefed young man. It recalls French's equally handsome and kerchiefed relief figure of a sailor in fighting costume from his Dewey Medal of 1898. French kept plaster models of the medal in the studio, so this image possibly influenced Margaret's rendering. She often worked in the Chesterwood studio alongside her father, or down in a smaller studio, now known as the Meadowlark, which is also on Chesterwood's property. While French's sailor is meant to embody an ideal type, a male counterpart to female allegorical representations of victory, there's more specificity and immediacy in Margaret's work. Later, she would consider herself a biographer in stone, and the seeds of that specialty can be seen in these very early works. The subject and presentation of Italian youth resembles sculptor Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's Head of a Spanish Peasant, which Margaret might have known, as Whitney exhibited it in her studio in New York's MacDougal Alley, the same artist enclave where French kept a studio. Later, as chairman of the Committee on Sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, French arranged for the acquisition of Whitney's Spanish Peasant in 1916. And as you probably know, Whitney was also an avid collector of art, and she went on to found the Whitney Museum in 1931. In September 1920, while preparing to go abroad, Margaret wrote to Penn about having the Italian youth cast in bronze and then sent around to different exhibitions, which would be very nice, she wrote, as I hate to leave it lying idle all the time while I am gone. Receiving special treatment from the foundry, Margaret commented, I find it is a great help in the art world to be my father's daughter. And this work will be on view in the Chesterwood studio later in August. Margaret sculpted this portrait of her dashing husband 2 years after their marriage. Penn Cresson wears his military uniform with 3 bars, indicating his officer status earned during World War I. About this time, Margaret and Penn suffered the loss of their newborn son, who had died at birth. They did not have any other children, and Margaret instead began to focus more seriously on her career in sculpture. As you can imagine, in general, it was difficult for women artists to manage a household, raise children, and have a career in art as well. Many who were successful were either independently wealthy, such as Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Anna Hyatt Huntington. Others chose to live alternative lifestyles like Malvina Hoffman or with female partners such as Harriet Frischmuth, Janet Scudder, and Violet Oakley. There were those who attempted to balance family life with a career, such as the underappreciated Black sculptor Augusta Savage. Although she died in relative obscurity, her contributions to sculpture and the Harlem Renaissance are becoming more well known. This bronze portrait of Penn Cresson is on view in Chesterwood's Permanent Collections Gallery, and it's actually situated right next to Longman's portrait of Margaret as a bacchante that we saw earlier. Mary French, Margaret's mother, was usually busy running the household, managing menus, and hosting Friday afternoon teas, both in New York and at Chesterwood. In her spare time, she wrote short stories with colorful characters drawn from friends and family. One story titled The Mother of a Debutante recounts the coming out of Peggy and Dot, clearly modeled on her own daughter and her cousin, Dorothy Schoonmaker. She described Mrs. Wetherell, most likely based on herself, as naturally shy, her small face was sensitive and fine, her soft brown hair drawn carefully back from her forehead. People who knew her well were inclined to call her lovely. Mary French actually wrote almost 50 short stories, as well as a menu book, poetry, and short novels, none of them published, except her Memories of a Sculptor's Wife, a series of anecdotes about her upbringing in Washington, D.C., and her life as a mother, wife, and hostess to illustrious Chesterwood visitors, wealthy patrons, famous artists, and even the dancer Isadora Duncan. Margaret seems to have relied upon a photograph of her mother for the diminutive profile bas-relief, which is just 7 inches square, very tiny. Delicately modeled, the work is a tribute to her refined and lovely mother. We recently learned that the plaster version of this portrait is in the collection of the Concord Museum in Concord, Massachusetts. I find that it's interesting to compare the two. While the marble is diaphanous and soft, the plaster version is closer to Margaret's original conception, and the lines are more deeply incised, and the portrait seems more crisp and concise. This is one of my favorite portraits. Catherine Louise Littauer was the only child of a millionaire glove manufacturer, and her family was prominent in New York and Washington society. She met William Doler, a former Army officer who ran an auto dealership. When the couple announced, announced their plans to wed in early 1923, her parents whisked her off to Paris and tried to prevent the marriage. Newspapers avidly followed this sensational saga. Eventually, all was reconciled and the couple married. Margaret sculpted this elegant portrait of Mrs. Doler shortly after the wedding. She is swathed in a dramatic wrap, and her hairpiece recalls the French headgear worn by Anne Boleyn, the infamous wife of Henry VIII. Not quite sure what is implied by all that. Margaret probably knew Mrs. Doler socially, as she and Penn spent winters in Washington, D.C., and Margaret kept a studio in their townhouse. And I just show you a portrait of Anne Boleyn so that you can see the similarities in the headpiece that I was talking about. Another particularly fine work is Francesca, which recalls Italian Renaissance portraits by artists such as Verrocchio and Francesco Laurana, whose portrait of a woman is at right. Francesca was described by a critic as a head of a mystic and aloof beauty. The portrait is terminated with a leaf design and a decorative scallop shell. Her hair is wrapped in a scarf that ripples and rests gently on her right shoulder, and her sheared neckline is intricately carved. It was rendered lifelike through delicate tinting. Margaret sent the work to the 1927 Winter Exhibition at the National Academy of Design, where it won the Julia A. Shaw Memorial Prize, an award that recognized artistic merit in figure painting or sculpture by a woman. We are planning to exhibit Francesca in the Chesterwood studio later this summer. Margaret may have been inspired by works that she saw around her at Chesterwood. La Jeunesse by Herbert Adams, which was displayed on a pedestal in the Chesterwood garden and is now in the studio. And the Italianate portrait of a woman from the studio of American sculptor Larkin Mead, which is in the dining room. Evelyn Beatrice Longman also utilized this style of portraiture in her portrayals of Margaret as a young girl, which is at the left, and of her cousin Louise French, who we met earlier, now in the Luce Center for the Study of American Art at the Metropolitan Museum. Over the course of 20 years, Margaret made 3 portraits of George Merrill, a friend and distant cousin who had grown up in Stockbridge. The classically handsome Merrill is college age in the first portrait, so we move from left to right, a grown adult in the second, and an older adult in the third. Titled The Evolution of Man, the series charts the maturation of his features and character, as well as Margaret's portraiture style. With an honest and strong gaze that spans the years and does not lessen through time, Merrill can be seen as an allegorical everyman, moving confidently through each stage of life. Numerous preparatory photographs are in the Chesterwood archives. Particularly striking are the in-process images. The adult George Merrill posing with his portrait in progress, and the resemblance, I think, is striking. Margaret has not only sensitively captured his physical features, but also his posture, his gaze, and even elements of his personality. The first portrait, the far left, was done for Merrill's mother. It won the Crown and Shield Prize at the annual Stockbridge exhibition. It descended in their family and it recently sold at auction, but unfortunately we are not aware of its current location. So if anyone comes across it, please do get in touch with me. A reporter once commented on Margaret's versatility and her ability to understand many different types. Here's her portrait of a popular hero of the day, Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, famed explorer of the polar regions. Like her father, Margaret was scientific and methodical in creating her sculpture. It is possible Byrd sat for her, as we have her recorded measurements indicating the width of his nose, the width of the inner section of his eyes, nose to the back of the ear, width of his shoulders, etc. Literally stripped of any identifying attributes, his fur-lined parka or goggles, other accoutrement of exploration, we are left with Byrd's rugged, weather-worn features, wind-blown curls, and his clear, penetrating explorer's gaze. The bronze, formerly at the Corcoran Gallery, is now in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Margaret was acquainted with Dr. Austin Riggs, who was practicing psychiatry in Stockbridge. She had sought his help to recover from exhaustion and other ailments following World War I. Dr. Lawrence Lunt was a colleague of Riggs and commissioned this portrait of his young son, Larry. In Journey into Fame, Margaret recalls the difficulties in modeling the 8-month-old impish baby as he crawled around on the Lunt side porch. She told her father that she had decided to do the Lunt baby laughing, to which he replied, "Donatello did a laughing baby." Undeterred by the comparison, she pressed on and came up with the idea to include the strong hands of the father clasping the wriggling baby. The New York Times wrote that when this work was exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery, it attracted attention and praise from connoisseurs. The paper reported it is probably one of the first examples by an American sculptor who has succeeded in capturing a smile of so young a subject in a portrait bust. As an adult, Larry Lunt visited Chesterwood in 1991, and according to a letter he sent following his tour, he had told the guide that he was the model for the baby in the work, and she didn't believe him. It amused me, he wrote, and I didn't persist. This work will also be on view in the Chesterwood studio later this summer. Margaret's portraits of children are informal and respond to the vivaciousness of young sitters. This portrait of young Frances Thankful is one of her most appealing bas-reliefs. The juxtaposition of the photograph with the final composition reveals that Margaret relied heavily on preparatory images of her subjects. In the final work, she has masterfully captured the toddler's chubby cheeks and dimpled elbow, floppy locks of hair, and clever expression. She clutches an apple in her hands, and as you take a closer look, even her little thumb is charming. Pamela French was the daughter of Margaret's cousin Prentice. Here, a group of preparatory snapshots alongside photos of the work in progress show Margaret's proficiency in crafting a portrait from photographs. She became a specialist in children's portraits and was commissioned to make many, including reliefs of Sandy Cunningham, a son of her close friend Teresa, Rhoda Whitridge, the great-granddaughter of British poet Matthew Arnold, Margot Roebling de Hoop, a descendant of the engineer who had built the Brooklyn Bridge, and Constance Hanna, granddaughter of a businessman and politician Mark Hanna, who had purchased an expansive farm in Stockbridge. In 1930, Grand Central Art Galleries in New York gave her a one-person show, which included 27 of her works. This photo shows a few of her works from that exhibition, including some that we have seen that you may recognize now, including Father and Son at far left, and The Italian Peasant just off of the center. She exhibited at numerous other art shows, galleries, and museums, including the Whitney and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Paris Salon, and the 1939 New York World's Fair. In 1923, Daniel Chester French wrote to a friend, "Margaret has finished the bust of me, and it is considered the best likeness of me yet. Really, she has done mighty well with it, and I rather guess that this will conduct me down the ages as my recognized portrait." Her first effort, a smaller portrait, which is now at Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, is indeed the definitive portrait bust of French. This is a reworking of that first effort, and it includes more of French's torso and more of his artist's smock. The plaster is at Chesterwood, and a bronze is in the Hall of American Artists at New York University. I'm afraid it's currently in storage as they're doing some renovation, but hopefully will be on view again soon. Margaret collaborated with her father on a number of works, including the Bashford Dean Memorial Tablet at the Metropolitan Museum, for which she did the lettering, and the Mallinckrodt Memorial Tablet for Harvard University. After French died in 1931, she finished his portrait of Daniel Webster. It was dedicated at the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Webster's birth in Franklin, New Hampshire, and the collaborative effort was well received. A reviewer found it a most excellent characterization, a work which, in its modeling, shows quite obviously the firm touch of Daniel Chester French and the more delicate, but likewise knowing handling of his daughter. At left, Margaret stands in the Chesterwood studio. The wreath from French's funeral hangs upon his model of the seated Lincoln. French is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, and Margaret designed the grave marker, which reads, "A Heritage of Beauty." Margaret's husband, Penn, died just 7 months later. She continued to work in sculpture, but her output slowed as she spent more and more time focusing on Chesterwood, writing a biography of her father and working to perpetuate his legacy. Just a few last works of sculpture by her. In 1925, Daniel Chester French had written to fellow artist Herbert Adams about the fact that the accomplished female sculptors Malvina Hoffman and Harriet Frischmuth were not yet members of the National Academy, an honor bestowed on artists of merit and accomplishment. He mused, "I have a sort of feeling that my daughter might go in, but certainly she ought not to be in advance of those I have named." Hoffman and Frischmuth were accepted into the National Academy shortly thereafter, and Margaret became an associate member in 1942. Upon becoming a full member in 1959, she submitted this cast stone version of Donna Alicia as her diploma work, indicating that "I did it a number of years ago, and I think it is one of my best things." The figure's classical hairstyle and truncated arms seem to refer to ancient Greek statuary, such as the Venus de Milo, or a more contemporary example in Chesterwood's parlor, Eve, by American sculptor Thomas Ball, in whose Florence studio French had worked in the 1870s. A base in the form of an Ionic capital strengthens this connection. The Unknown Soldier was displayed in a special exhibition at Grand Central Art Galleries in New York from February to March 1941, after Germany had invaded Poland, but before the United States had joined World War II. The soldier seems based upon Margaret's boyfriend, Philip Mills, who had been killed in France during World War I, and you might recognize this photo as I showed it earlier. The figure gazes outward with blank eyes and a calm, resigned expression. He is decorated with 3 medals. From left to right, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the U.S. Victory Medal. The soldier is stripped of his uniform, and the medals are pinned onto his somewhat abstracted chest, which recalls the herm form from ancient Greece, a head and perhaps a torso above a plain, usually squared lower section. The herm form was often used for figures of gods, such as in the statue of the hero Heracles, as well as for famous public figures, especially writers like Socrates and Plato. The soldier's hair is rendered in thick masses, resembling a laurel wreath, a symbol of triumph worn about the head. While the soldier seems based upon Philip Mills, he represents any and all soldiers who have gone off to war and have not returned. The soldier is one man as well as every man, and Margaret has instilled him with a sense of the eternal and the divine. In 1960, the National Academy of Design commissioned Margaret to design a medal to be awarded annually for sculpture in the classic tradition. This would be her final tribute to her father in sculpture, as in the 1960s, she would turn her attention full-time to Chesterwood and to preserving her father's artistic legacy. Like her father, Margaret painted for her own private enjoyment and relaxation, and she gravitated towards flower paintings and still lifes. Here she was inspired by 2 works by her father, a maquette of painting and sculpture for the Richard Morris Hunt Memorial in New York, and Artemis, or Diana, the Huntress. French made a number of small figurines of Artemis, and there are other examples in which her arms are not truncated, and she holds her characteristic bow. These 2 maquettes that I show here can be seen in Chesterwood's Study Collection Gallery. Another still life includes plants and sculpture. This work includes the bronze maquette of Memory, reminiscent of Michelangelo's figure of Night from the Medici tomb in Florence that I show you above. The large-scale version of Memory is at the Metropolitan Museum. In the painting, Margaret seems to use light and shadow to accentuate the androgynous nature of the figure, making it seem more muscular and masculine, and even more indebted to Michelangelo's work than French's was. And I haven't figured out what the painting is in the background. I had thought it might have been a work at Chesterwood, but I haven't been able to identify it yet. Margaret was inspired by everything she saw at Chesterwood. Here are 2 sketches of Andromeda, the magnificent large-scale marble figure that was her father's last, most private work. And on the same page, 2 dancers sketched after the tiny porcelain figures that decorated the dining room table. She is clearly interested in gesture, arm movements, and musculature, and the flow of the body, no matter how large or small the object of her inspiration. And I love that both Andromeda and the dancing figures are about the same size on the piece of paper when they are dramatically different in real life. This still life, which includes a delicate spray of flowers in a glass vase, a wooden mallet, and glass fishing buoys, also includes a plaster cast of a hand, seemingly clutching a cluster of blossoms. I found it interesting to compare Margaret's painting with the Surrealist Still Life by René Magritte, who also includes a plaster cast of a hand. Plaster casts of various hands can be seen in the studio. French often cast hands of his models, family members, and his own hands as studies for larger works of sculpture. He also ordered commercial casts of hands from the firm Caproni & Son in Boston. At the far left are French's own hands, cast as studies for the seated American Lincoln, and at the very far right is a cast of Margaret's right hand. And finally, this portrait of a woman wearing a party dress and a delicate ribbon necklace with a vibrant red flower affixed to it seems particularly insightful. As in Berthe Morisot's Woman at her Toilette, the subject looks away from the artist. Her bared shoulders and hint of cleavage are particularly sensual, and the entire work is rendered in a lively color palette. Yet the subject has been captured in a private moment, before appearing at a party or other social event, before she has put on her public face and personality. Both works hint at the contemplative private life hidden behind a social exterior. Later in life, Margaret mused that her wasted youth was spent on parties and boys, and as she grew older, she realized she was happier taking part in quieter, more introspective pursuits. After the death of both of her parents in the 1930s, Margaret inherited Chesterwood. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, she spent her summers there, sculpting and writing. In the 1950s, she returned to live at Chesterwood full-time. She was driven to preserve her father's artistic legacy and amassed a large collection of his preparatory studies, plaster casts, and finished works. At the left, she is seated in the Chesterwood studio in front of her father's bronze portrait of the poet-philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, and below the bronze working model for his standing Lincoln for the Nebraska State Capitol. Margaret created a museum in the studio and opened its doors to the public in 1955, with the trustees of reservations administering the property. At the right, she speaks to an audience gathered in the studio garden for the momentous occasion of the public opening. In 1969, she ceded all of Chesterwood to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the current administrator of the site. She is pictured at left with the full-size replica she commissioned of her father's standing Lincoln, and at the right with the plaster portrait of her father that we saw earlier in the studio. Margaret continued to live in the residence, and she organized exhibitions such as this one of her own sculpture. You may recognize some of the portraits in the photograph, George Merrill and Francesca. When she died in 1973, the residence was turned over to the National Trust. It is thanks to Margaret's vision, energy, and perseverance that Chesterwood survives as a testament to her father's life work. Chesterwood's collection of works by Daniel Chester French might be the largest collection of work by a single artist. The site is also a repository of Margaret's sculpture and painting, and we are hoping to exhibit even more of her work in coming seasons. When you visit Chesterwood today, the interior of the studio has been restored to look as it did when French was working there. You can see the model for the Lincoln at the left and French's last work, the marble Andromeda, in the center of the studio. And here is the exterior of the studio, showing the studio garden and fountain that French designed and by which Margaret posed so often. At left is a photograph of Margaret and French in the studio garden, and at right, what this view from the studio looks like today. In 1911, Daniel Chester French wrote to his close friend, Newton Mackintosh, "I hope you will come to Chesterwood and rest. It is as beautiful as fairyland here now. The hemlocks are decorating themselves with their light green tassels. The laurel is beginning to blossom, and the peonies are a glory in the garden. I go about in an ecstasy of delight over the loveliness of things." In 1920, Margaret wrote to her future husband, "It is good to be home again. Chesterwood is lovely. The grass is green, but otherwise things are pretty hazy in coloring. And in spite of it, it's sweet here so early, and I love it. I love the clean white birches on the mountainsides with the strong dark pines. Daniel Chester French and his daughter Margaret were both accomplished artists. He created magnificent public monuments and memorials, allegorical works that commemorate and lament on a national scale. Her intimate portraits celebrate the fine details of personality, her subject's very nature of being. Both of them loved and cherished Chesterwood, where they each worked to create a heritage of beauty to pass down through the ages. I hope you will come visit us at Chesterwood this summer to delight in the loveliness of things. And thank you so much for choosing to be here tonight to celebrate the life and accomplishments of Margaret French Cresson. So thank you.
Thank you, Dana. This is Gwen speaking. We do have a couple of questions, but I can't resist mentioning right now to follow up on your invitation that we are going to finally host our annual sculpture conference at Chesterwood next year, June 2nd through 6th. So I hope that you will visit this summer, as Dana has just invited you, but that you will also join us there as a group next summer. We're really looking forward to it. It's so beautiful. Just viewing those images makes me want to get in the car and drive up right now.
Please do.
We do have a couple of questions. You can probably see them in the chat room, but let's see, Lawrence Bechtel is asking, do you know if she used oil-based or water-based clay for her portraits?
That is a very technical question, and unfortunately, I do not know what exactly she used. I haven't found a record of it, and to tell you honestly, as an art historian and not as an artist, I'm not sure I would be able to tell the difference. So I apologize for not having that answer, but if you want to send me an email, I can try to track down that information, and I can put my email in the chat, and also mention that if anyone else has a question that is not answered tonight, or a question occurs to you at some other time, to please contact me. We love hearing from the public and answering questions. So I will I'll put my email address in the chat. That's okay.
Thank you. And Larry, we can figure it out together next summer when you come to the sculpture conference. Another question, did you say that Larry, as in Laughing Larry, the portrait of the baby, was the son of Austin Riggs?
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have sped through that a little too quick. Austin Riggs, who started the Austin Riggs Institute in Stockbridge, worked with a number of other doctors, and one of the other doctors was Dr. Lawrence Lunt, and his son was Larry Lunt. So he obviously the son was named after the father. So Dr. Lawrence Lunt was a colleague of Austin Riggs. Larry was Dr. Lunt's son.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry if that was not clear.
Yeah. And then the first question, actually, which I do know the answer to, but the question is to you. Did Daniel Chester French sculpt the John Harvard on Harvard's campus?
Yes, indeed he did. He is, I think it was from the 1880s. And as you may know, there was there weren't any images of John Harvard in existence. Very little was known about his features. So French asked a friend of his, Sherman Hoare, who was a descendant of Puritans, to model for the John Harvard. And after its dedication, Emily Dickinson sent him a note of congratulations, which we are happy to. We often quote from that when we're talking about French and mentioning the John Harvard. And I'm sure you've visited and you've seen that when visitors come to see Harvard and Harvard Square, they rub his foot, and so it's quite shiny. So yes, indeed, French did do John Harvard. He also did many public sculptures on college campuses. He did works for Princeton, for Lafayette, for Columbia, Ball State University. There are many works by French on college campuses.
Thank you. And Christian is asking, where did the French wealth come from? Was it from Daniel?
It's interesting that everybody thinks that the French family was so wealthy. They were certainly comfortable, and he made very good investments. And he also was paid quite well for his work. And we actually have his account book in which he lists all the income that he made from his commissions, but also the outlay. We often forget that not only he was being paid, but then he had to pay marble carvers, models. There were a lot of other expenses. So he might have been paid handsomely for some of his works, but he had a lot of expenses. I think I can't remember offhand, but we do have some translations of how much he was paid for work for commissions back then and how it compares to money today, given inflation. And I think sometimes it translates to close to $100,000 sometimes for a commission. So he was paid quite well. And there's some interesting stories about his Yankee ingenuity and his Yankee sort of penny pinching, and how he was able to save money here, but he was also quite generous in supporting artists who might not have been doing as well. And he also supported a young opera singer, both financially and by giving her opportunities to perform at Chesterwood. So I think they did quite well. Oh, and I'm sorry, one more thing. Sorry, my answers are quite long-winded. He also made some very good investments. He had very good investment advice. And they might have lost some money in 1929, but it was not disastrous for them. So they certainly did quite well.
Thank you. And then Esther is asking, did she, meaning Margaret, carve her own marble sculptures, or did she engage the service of a stone carver?
Right. She would create her portraits probably in clay or plastiline. As many of you are artists, you probably know more about this process than I do. And then have a plaster cast from that, which she would then send to a foundry to be cast into bronze, or to a carver to be carved into marble, such as the Piccirilli brothers, who are marble carvers, or I mentioned Gorham's foundry, where she would have bronzes made. I don't believe she was in the habit of doing the carving herself, but she would probably do some of the finishing like her father did. He didn't do the actual carving, but he would often finish works with sort of more precise tools.
Mm-hmm. And then Wesley is asking, does Chesterwood offer a book about Margaret with some of the photos from this presentation?
Well, I've often talked with the executive director here about what we can do to publicize Margaret and her works. And she has often encouraged me to write a biography or a monograph, but that has not been done just yet. So for now, I would advise going to the Chesterwood website, and you can take a look at the online exhibition. And also a couple of years ago, I published an article about Margaret in Fine Art Connoisseur, which mostly deals with her life and growing up at Chesterwood. There's a little bit of overlap with the article in Sculpture Review, but it kind of takes a different tack. So you can see some more photographs and some more information about her in that article. So hopefully one day there'll be a book or a monograph about her.
Dana, thank you so much for your time and for that wonderful presentation. And I look forward to meeting you, we all do, in person next June, if not sooner.
I think I'll be talking again, hopefully on Margaret, and showing you some works in person.
Good.
So I look forward to that as well.
That's great. That'll be a lovely follow-up to this, a personal tour of the actual works.